Hello, and welcome to ABA 516 Radical Behaviorism Module 3. Today we're going to be discussing learning in behavior analysis. Here are your objectives and expectations for this lecture. And this is the material we're working off of. So last week, just to recap, we started off with talking about some of the popular causes of behavior, right? And so some of those things were that the brain causes behavior, so that would be a neural sort of explanation. A psychic explanation would be that the mind causes behavior, or your personality is the reason for your behavior. And some of the reasons that are very popular are conception, right? So intelligence or intuition. So when we think about that brain, those examples of brain causing behavior, sometimes we may look at things like brain fog or nervous breakdown or saying you're wired or your nerves on edge or the nerve to do something. Uh, the thing is that behavior can be absolutely influenced by biology or genetics, but you can't really manipulate those variables to control behavior. You can only sort of observe them as it is or observe those phenomena. Um, this becomes circular because when we're describing why behavior occurs, um, or rather like this sort of like I'm wired, therefore I'm behaving this way. How do you know I'm behaving this way? Because I'm wired. That's sort of like circular reasoning. Uh, is not really a solid explanation for why behavior occurs. But some of those ways of describing processes can tell us how they work. So when we observe our nervous system, we can't use that information to predict behavior because our nervous system itself is technically behaving. So when the body, for example, is experiencing arousal, we can describe the state of the nervous system during arousal, but but is arousal itself a behavior, or is it running, fighting, hiding? Simply because the body is in an arousal state, we cannot say it caused any responding, simply that it is correlational or concurrently occurring as a state when an organism is engaging in behaviors of running, fighting, and hiding. So if we ask the question, can neural processes be variables that evoke specific behaviors or occasion specific behaviors? Absolutely. Are they causes of behavior? Definitely not. Similarly, when we're thinking about those psychic explanations of behavior like personality or mind, again, we can't directly observe the mind, right? Where would you say that your mind is? So we can't observe the mind, even though we can observe the brain. So we cannot exactly pinpoint some sort of abstract processes underlying thinking. He had an idea, is has no physical dimension, so it lends itself to becoming a hypothetical construct. And then when we look at those conceptual causes of behavior, those are our explanatory fictions. Hunger doesn't cause behavior. Hunger is a description of a condition. Uh, or a setting event or an MO, if you will. We might also see things like he's intelligent because he got great scores. How do you know or what do his scores indicate that he's intelligent? Again, we fall into that trap of circular reasoning. So a single set of facts, when used to describe both cause and effect, they're not necessarily accurate in terms of understanding the why of behavior. So, when we look at all of these causes from a radical behaviorism perspective, we would call these teleological explanations of behavior. Essentially, we are attempting to describe events in terms of their goal, which is not the same as the cause. One thing that I like to clarify at this point is when Skinner says the organism is always right. Johnston also talks about this in a different way. So, if someone fails to learn a skill in spite of a thorough teaching effort, rather than assuming that the limitation lies in the person's ability to learn, we turn to another possibility that the instructional effort was short of the best effort of the best that our technology has to offer. What that basically means is that if we're not seeing the behavior that we want to see, it is not an issue with the organism, it is an issue of the conditions under which that behavior is occurring. So change the conditions and you can change the behavior. So when we say the learner is always right, that doesn't mean that people can't make mistakes or people don't make mistakes. Mistakes are simply learning itself. What it means is that the organism's behavior is occasioned by its environment. So if the organism's behavior does not match the behavior you are aiming for or hoping for, what we need to be doing is changing the conditions to change the behavior. But first, we need to understand what is a behavior. And for this, we go to Johnson and Pennypacker, who give us this like very sort of um, I don't want to say only clear explanation, but like very uh, precise or specific explanation of what behavior is. So Johnson and Pennypacker say the behavior of an organism is that portion of an organism's interaction with its environment that is characterized by detectable displacement in space through time of some part of the organism and that results in a measurable change in at least one aspect of the environment. And we're going to break this down. So let's take the first part. What is behavior? The behavior of an organism is that portion of an organism's interaction with the environment. What this means is that behavior, or when we're trying to understand behavior, we don't just look at the response. Behavior comprises of response environment interactions. Um, and so we don't only look at um, we never look at the response without looking at the response in context. So when we look at responses in context, that's what we're calling behavior. Behavior never occurs in a vacuum. What that means is that behavior always involves the environment, right? It doesn't happen in isolation. The environment is what provides the context for what behavior is occurring. So, if we take the example of a child clapping their hands when they hear music, the music is part of that environment. Looking at clapping in isolation does not give us a lot of useful information other than being able to topographically describe a behavior, but it tells us little to nothing about its function if we were attempting to change that behavior. The next part of this is that behavior, meaning that interaction with the environment, is characterized by detectable displacement in space through time of some part of the organism, which means that the organism needs to be doing something that can be observed over time. It happens over time, not all at once. So when a person waves hello, their arm moves through space over a certain duration. This movement can be seen and can be like occurs through a time displacement. It doesn't occur in zero amount of time or a single amount of time. Um, Even subtle movements, right, like raising an eyebrow, turning your head, or other sort of non-vocal behavior, also take time, and so they can also be counted if they're observable. And few weeks from now, we're going to talk about how almost all behavior is observable, even the behavior that we think is not. But that's jumping ahead. And so the final piece of this definition results in a measurable change in at least one aspect of the environment, meaning the behavior produces some change in the environment. If there's no change, then it's not a behavior per this definition. So when someone flips a light switch, the light turns on. That change in the environment, dark to light, was caused or was a result of them engaging in that particular behavior, and we can measure that change. This, again, when we get into the weeks of talking about covert events or private events, or things that are very low in magnitude, we'll see that this definition still continues to remain can still be applied for those behaviors as well. Remember that environment is not simply the physical space an organism occupies, it is the context of behavior. And that can comprise of very many things, including verbal stuff. And so when we take these sort of three-part definition, right? Like one, we're looking at an interaction between behavior, response and context. Two, it has to take time, meaning it doesn't occur in 0 seconds or 0 minutes or zero any time. And it produces some change in at least one aspect of the environment. And so this gives us a pretty clear indication of like what can we call behavior and what can we not, right? Or do you think that there are times where that may not be true? And this brings us to the dead person's test. So you're already familiar with the dead person's test from when you took your measurements class, but just to recall, Lindsley uh, devised this test essentially because he was looking at behaviors in schools and was noticing that people were selecting behaviors for behavior management that or selecting behaviors to intervene on that weren't actually behavior. And so he came up with this sort of like hack to be able to identify behavior, right? If a dead person can do it, it is not a behavior. And this was his sort of way of making, of like giving people a sort of simple way to identify behavior. It's essentially like, does something count as a behavior? And the other part that it does, it sort of makes people actively look for behavior because you have to keep asking if a dead person can do it, is it not behavior? Um, so, for example, if a person can lie still, that's not a behavior. If a dead person can't do it, then it probably is a behavior. So that's a pretty clever cheat or a hack, if you will. But if you remember from the Critchfield article, Critchfield argues that the dead person's test is a tautology, meaning a statement that is true by necessity or by virtue of its logical form. So, some questions to ask, right? What exactly do we mean by dead? How do we define dead? Is it just, does brain death count? Does cardiac death count? Is it legal death? It may vary. The thing about the dead person's test is that it requires you to prove that a dead person cannot do something. So, how would you test it scientifically, right? How would you take baseline and intervention data on subjects that are fundamentally not behaving? You can only prove its opposite. You can only prove when behavior occurs, but you can't really scientifically prove uh, when that a dead person is not behaving. Or can you? That'll be part of your ICA this week. It also implies that behavior is a fixed trait, right? That dead people can't behave, which sort of goes against everything that we were talking about with that initial definition, that behavior is shaped by environment. Um, so it's kind of fundamentally antithetical to behavior analysis or radical behaviorism itself. So my question to you is, do you think this way of like thinking or like using this dead person's test is a popular way to discriminate behaviors from non-behavior? Like y'all learned about it in class, but is it a way that like say you were learned to discriminate between behavior and not behavior in your training as an RBT or in your training in like any behavior, any adjacent fields? So if you work in schools, if you work in adult services, so on and so forth. And what do you think is the appeal of using the dead person's test? The other question to consider is, does the dead person test ever fail? So, if we consider how we would operationally define behaviors like sleeping or daydreaming or staring, would they be considered behaviors? If a dead person's eyes were open because of rigor mortis, would we consider that staring? If does sleeping, like, what are all of the components that you would require or needs to be included to call some to define the behavior of sleeping versus being a dead body? So let's say someone pushes another person, right? If you respond with "don't push others," this would fail the dead person test, as the dead person can do the behavior of quote unquote not pushing others, right? So this is um this is a great way to apologies if you can hear my phone go off in the background, by the way. I'm really sorry. I'm recording this from the conference. But anyway, coming back to the dead person test. So if we consider what the dead person test actually does, it sort of equates behavior with being alive and therefore precludes the labeling of anything a deceased person might do as behavior. And so when we look at scholarly interpretations of the dead person test, we've attempted to circumvent that tautology by providing face valid examples of actions that are performed frequently by at least some living people, right? And presumably can be generally agreed upon as behaviors um, by things that are like very clear actions that only people who are alive can do. But for some other topographies, that might not be actually as clear. And so it begs the question, does the dead person test work? And if anything, we're scientists, right? In order to demonstrate that the dead person test works, can we design an experiment to empirically validate the statement? Think about it. The next piece that we're going to be talking about today is reflexes and respondent conditioning. So reflexes, as you know, are stimulus response relations. Specifically, they are unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response relations. So unconditioned stimuli eliciting unconditioned responses. Reflexes are typically selected by phylogeny for the species, right? So reflexes were sort of the first mechanism when we think about scientifically understanding behavior broadly, because it challenged this long-standing belief that behavior must come from inner causes like the soul or someone's will. If something disconnected from the body could react to the environment, then maybe behavior in general wasn't always driven by some inner abstract agent or invisible agent. And so some people tried to salvage old views by claiming that the will must also extend into body parts even after they're severed. But that idea was clearly a stretch. And that brings us to understanding. Um, this like sort of initial understanding of some behaviors at least. And so what reflex actions tell us is that one, that there's some sort of mechanical process, right? So it's not in inner will or some abstraction controlling behavior. It's that there's something happening in the environment that is exerting control over behavior. Additionally, we can predict reflexes much more easily than we predict operant behavior, right? But the problem is that, not the problem really, but the reality is that respondent behavior makes up a very small fraction of all behavior. So while it's really helpful to understand stimulus response relations and even extend that to understanding how conditioning can happen using stimulus response relations, uh, they only help us understand a very, very small part um, of the repertoire of an organism. What they do allow us to do is to operationally define things like behavior, latency, and magnitude, and so on and so forth, because of the topographical variability. And that's also where we see a lot of Pavlov's work come from, right? Pavlov observed this phenomenon and then spent his life studying conditioned reflexes. Essentially, came from attempting to study the conditions under which salivation secretions occurred. How did the digestive system work? So, going from like the dog was thinking about food and calling it psychic reflexes, Pavlov basically set out to disprove that. And that's how we get classical conditioning. And the process of conditioning has survival value for reflexes, right? Like we're born with reflexes, even though some of them go out. Like you don't have to be actively taught to breathe. Like you didn't have to be actively taught to cry as a baby, even though that crying then takes on so many other functions and complex functions later in your life as your repertoire builds. But like gaining attention for the purpose of survival was not a thing that every individual organism had to learn. It's an evolutionary process. So it only provides a mechanism by which the individual acquires responses to particular features of an environment after they've been encountered. Um, and where inherited behavior leaves off, the inherited modifiability of the process of conditioning takes over. And not every that and that's unconditioned reflexes, right? When we go through the respondent conditioning process and get to conditioned reflexes, not every conditioned reflex has to have survival value. What does have to have survival value, or what does have survival value, is the process of conditioning itself. Like, conditioning is a thing that gets transmitted from generation to generation. We don't have to be taught for our behavior to be conditioned. Our behavior is susceptible to conditioning. And when we come to think about the conditioned reflex, right? Like, what is the value of a conditioned reflex, or how do we see conditioned reflexes play out? Emotional responding is a great sort of example of conditioned reflexes. So, like, this behavior, this response of crying is established in your repertoire, or like being responsive to pain. But sometimes you cry when you're happy. Sometimes you cry when you're feeling nostalgic. Sometimes you cry when you're experiencing a whole other host of emotions. It doesn't only always equate to sadness. In the same way that sadness or grief or any sort of painful aversive stimulus is not only eliciting crying as a response, we see so many other ways in which people emote. Uh, that they call, experiencing crying or grieving or experiencing pain in any form. And so, something to think about is like, why does it matter for us to understand emotions in as a conditioned reflex, or at least part of emotional responding being a conditioned reflex? I like to think about stories, pieces of media, art, music, literature. Like, think about a story or a piece of art or any of these things that, like, you associate with very strong emotions. They can be any type of emotion, but strong emotions. What are those emotions? And, like, how do you think that might have been established? And so when we look at the properties of elicited behavior itself, we have the laws of reflex, right? So we have threshold value, which is that the value at which an eliciting stimulus is salient to elicit a response. So the eliciting stimulus needs to be at a certain magnitude. If it's lower than that threshold value, then it's not going to elicit the associated response. We can also measure reflex strength by assessing latency latency duration, and magnitude. We look at response latency being typically varying inversely with stimulus magnitude, meaning the stronger the stimulus is, the faster the response occurs. Response magnitude and duration typically vary directly with the stimulus magnitude. So the strength of the response and how long a response occurs is directly proportional to how strong the eliciting stimulus is. And typically, the unit of behavior when we look at elicited behavior is the reflex relation itself. So it's that condition stimulus condition response relation. Remember, we never look at responses in isolation, we look at responses in context, and that's what we call behavior. The other thing to consider about elicited behavior is relative frequencies, right? We can define the effects of stimuli by comparing response probability when a stimulus is present with response probability uh, when the stimulus is absent. Um, Meaning, depending on how frequently a stimulus occurs and corresponds to the presence of the response, we can use that to determine or make predictions of the likelihood of those things occurring in the future. We can also utilize conditional probability, right? The probability of one event or response is given in relation to the occurrence or non-occurrence of the stimulus itself. When we think about these things, what's a concept in operant learning that is similar to this one? And then when we look at successive elicitations, right? So what happens when we establish a conditioned reflex and then we see its repetition? We keep the eliciting stimulus is repeatedly presented or repeatedly occurs. We might see some um, we might see some effects, right? So, one, the organism could habituate, meaning we see a reduction in responding with the repeated presentation of the eliciting stimulus. So, for example, if you live in the city and you're used to like traffic sounds and horns and like the siren sounds and things like that, you probably don't get startled every single time when compared to the responses of somebody who lives in, say, uh, by the countryside or where there's not a lot of traffic, or they live in the woods, or they live in the mountain, or they live by the ocean. They may turn their head to every siren sound compared to you if you are a city person. Another effect of successful or another phenomenon observed as a result of successive elicitations is potentiation, right? The persistent strengthening of elicited responses based on recent patterns of activity. So initially, the eliciting stimulus might elicit a pretty strong response, and then over time, it may elicit stronger and stronger responses. And so we call this potentiation. Tattoos, I find, can be an example of this. So you don't necessarily, for some people, the buzzing sound or whatever, you may habituate to the buzzing sound itself, right? But if you've ever gotten a tattoo and you experience the needles, all those needles poking really fast to get the ink under your skin happening rapidly, and the tattoo artist goes over the same line over and over and over, you don't get quote unquote used to the pain, but it might become progressively harder as your skin gets more sensitive to not pull your hand away. Even though you're technically used to the sensation, you might actually find yourself like being unable to, if you're sitting in long sessions, or if, going through some shading work, or like really thick lines, or even really fine lines, um, the skin gets more sensitive. It's like tattooing on like a sunburn. And so your response to that needle would be then considered potentiation. But like I said, not only are elicited responses a very small part of the repertoire, but a thing that we see as a function of learning over the course of a lifetime is that a lot of these responses can also come under operant control. And so think about like any instances, or can you think about any instances in which a conditioned reflex response or just reflexive responses in general can come under operant control? And if you can, I would ask you what you think the relevance of this phenomenon is to our practice. When we consider elicited and evoked responses, it is important for us to also make sure that we are understanding what the source of control of those responses are. Reflexes are respondent because they're elicited by antecedents. Reflexes themselves are involuntary and governed by unconditioned stimuli, and then you can have the conditioned reflex. Operants are what is also known as voluntary behavior. And it's called voluntary behavior not because we can choose to engage in a behavior, but that because it is all behaviors that are learned through the lifetime. They are not just behaviors that the organism is born with. And these are controlled by consequences and um, also governed by things like discriminative stimuli. And so when we look at operant behavior, we start out with Thorndike's law of effect. Thorndike famously did the puzzle box experiment, where if to sort of demonstrate that the cat learned to get out of the puzzle box, which is true. Thorndike was right about that. But what Thorndike was wrong about was how he determined what caused the cat to be able to escape the puzzle box. Thorndike's argument was that um, the cat's attempts to escape were stamped in to its brain, meaning uh, a process by which behaviors lead to satisfying outcomes may be more likely to occur in the future. Sound familiar, anyone? Reinforcement. But he called a stamping in because he made it an association and like an association in the brain as opposed to operant learning. So he said that when an action is, well, he didn't say, but I'm paraphrasing. When an action is followed by a rewarding consequence, the connection between the stimulus and the response is quote unquote stamped in, meaning it gets strengthened in the brain. And that was how he described learning through reinforcement, which, of course, now we understand that the cat's pressing a lever to escape a box is a product of essentially extinction induced variability. The cat tried a bunch of things, and then once it contacted success of escape, was more likely to hit the lever to get out of the puzzle box. Here's a question for y'all. Like, if we think about technology like generative AI and large learning models, right? Like, essentially, one can make the argument that generative AIs are trained using reinforcement and punishment conditions and run through a scenario thousands and thousands of times until they establish a solution. So, if that process is basically identical to what the rat is doing in an operant chamber, would we consider generative AI to be a living organism? Or how do we draw the line between the behavior of living organisms and the sort of contrived behavior of a machine, quote unquote, behaving? Just some food for thought. So, when we think about arranging consequences for operant behavior, Um, it's not, Skinner makes this sort of crucial discrimination that we're saying that reinforcement doesn't strengthen past behavior because past behavior is already over, but reinforcement selects past behavior, and we determine that because we see an increase in future behavior. So what a consequence does is not change what has already happened, but changes the future probability of that same response because of proximity, right? So it is the operant as a class of behavior rather than the response of a particular instance, which is conditioned, which is why Skinner makes that sort of like it's a governing principle that, throw back to ABA 500, reinforcers select classes of responses, not just individual topographies of responses. So my other question for you is how does Skinner distinguish the term response and operant? Skinner states that the operant must operate upon nature to produce its reinforcement. A prior stimulus, meaning the antecedent, even if it's the SD, is not eliciting a response. It's merely a setting event, right? It's an occasion upon which the response will be reinforced. He really emphasized the sort of role of each of the parts of the three-term contingency. The response operates on the environment, followed by a consequence. The antecedent is simply the setting under which that response consequence relation is occurring. So it is a consequence that plays a role in whether this behavior is likely to happen again or not. And this understanding of operant behavior, right? Like being very precise about the role of each part of the three-term contingency is also what allows us to more conceptually, systematically distinguish it from the two-term contingency or respondent conditioning. So again, to clarify, when we talk about operant control, as you all know, consequences evoke the behavior, but antecedents play a role as well. They give us information about the strength and value of the consequences and modify those in a momentary fashion. Operant extinction, of course, is the withholding of reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior. Um, there is we see or we observe a gradual decrease in behavior over time. We may also observe some effects of operant extinction, like the extinction burst, extinction-induced variability, and extinction-induced emotional responding. We also sometimes observe the phenomenon of resistance to extinction. Can you think of some instances of what that might look like? One important clarification is to clarify forgetting versus extinction. Extinction is not forgetting a behavior. Extinction is when the behavior is emitted but doesn't contact reinforcement, whereas forgetting is that the effect of conditioning has been lost, so the behavior is no longer emitted. When we talk about reinforcing events, we determine that an event is reinforcing only by observing the strength of the response in the future. So if the strength increases or if there is a change, we classify the event as reinforcing to the organism's repertoire under the existing conditions. Of course, these events can be positively or negatively reinforcing, and they can be conditioned or unconditioned. I find it useful to think about sort of this classification of conditioned and unconditioned and even generalized conditioned reinforcers when we think about um, uh, consequences like attention, affection, or approval.
right? A lot of these are like we make the argument that attention is an unconditioned reinforcer, but an unconditioned like attention is an unconditioned reinforcer only to the extent that it is at the basic level of survival of the organism over time, or the organism's repertoire over time. But we see attention take on a lot of nuanced forms that are learned or conditioned, right? Like if you think about attention in the context of social media, or attention, specifically attention functioning, or affection as a function of attention, or approval as a function of attention. Some of these become generalized conditioned reinforcers over time. And so attention as a broad category sort of falls into various forms or generations, can be unconditioned, can be conditioned, or can even be a generalized conditioned reinforcer. Um, so I would like you to think about like in what ways, when we think about attention as a GCR, that we give or withhold attention, affection, or approval in relationships, how uh, how is that shaped by what works, what gives it stability, and what gets us what we want in return. And so if we break it down to the contingencies occasioning these behaviors, right, especially in interpersonal relationships, does that make our connections with other humans any less real, or does that reveal something honest about how relationships work? Multiple things. When we think about why a stimulus is reinforcing, right? Like, why is a reinforcer reinforcing? It's not really about its form, right? The stimulus is not reinforcing, or like food is not reinforcing because it satisfies hunger. That's a circular response or a circular reasoning. But food is a reinforcer because it increases the frequency of any behavior that produces that particular consequence. And so when we use the language of like, or when we colloquially, sometimes we fall into this trap of circular reasoning or mentalisms to even talk about reinforcers. We say, reinforcing for the person instead of reinforcing for the behavior and things like that. So it's really important for us to, part of why like we are spending like this entire course talking about conceptually systematic precision, or the precision of like concept, is because it's really easy to fall into the trap of mentalistic explanations of behavior if we're not refining our conceptual knowledge of something. And so that's a lot of this lecture may be an overview of terms that you've already learned or concepts you've already learned in the past, but I really encourage you to think about like what is specifically what is precisely the mechanisms um, of each of those concepts that we are talking about. There's not an inherent nature, basically. It all depends ultimately on function.